Monitoring computers is very important and should include alerts being sent out when something has gone wrong, but ideally before a problem even occurs. Now, Prometheus does support alerting and you can customize your own alerts, but it relies on a separate entity known as Alertmanager to actually send alerts to an email server, for instance. But how do you install and set up Alertmanager and configure Prometheus to use it? And how do you create alerting rules in Prometheus? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, as that's what we'll be going over. Now, because this video is about setting up alerts for Prometheus, I'm going to assume that you already have Prometheus installed or you know how to set it up. If not, then I do have another video which shows you how to install and configure it in Docker. In addition, we'll be sending email alerts in this video, so I'm going to assume that you already have an email server you can send these to. But having said that, Alertmanager does support other messaging options as well. Now, Prometheus doesn't have a complete built-in alerting system. Instead, it relies on Alertmanager. So the first thing we need to do is to actually install Alertmanager. Now, because I'm using Docker Compose, what I'll need to do is edit my Docker Compose file here, and I'm going to use Nano for that. This is already set up to run Prometheus, Grafana, and other containers, so I don't need to put the version details in. The volume section here is already declared, but I'm going to put in an extra line in here because I want an actual volume setting up for Alertmanager. Then the services section is already defined, so I'm just going to go right to the end of the file here. Then I'm going to copy and paste in the details for Alertmanager. Now, for this, I do want the latest version of Alertmanager, and I'm providing a name here just for the visuals, basically, to make it easy to identify this. I'm sticking with the default ports, so in this case it's 9093. Now, as with all my other containers, this is something I want running 24/7, and usually I do want the actual container to automatically start up, for example, if the computer were to restart. But there might be cases where maybe I'm carrying out maintenance and I actually manually shut down the container because I want to do maintenance. In which case, that's why I've got restart set to unless stopped instead of always. Then for the actual volumes, well, I do actually want to configure this, and I want that configuration to survive a reboot. So what I've got here is a line to actually map the actual containers configuration file to an external file that we'll be setting up later on. And then I've also got a declaration here to actually map the /data folder to the volume that we've got defined higher up. So now that that's all declared, I'm going to save this actual file, exit out, and then that's our container setup. Now the next thing to do is to configure Alertmanager. In other words, to decide what to actually do with these alerts from Prometheus and where to send them to. So I want to keep my configurations separate for these containers, so I'm going to create a new folder called Alertmanager, and then I'll store the configuration file in there, and that's called alertmanager.yml. I'm then going to copy and paste in what is really just a bare bones configuration for email alerts, but it does actually support other options, so you can check the documentation if you want to do it in a different way. But what I've got here is a route section and a receivers section. So in route, I've got a setting for receiver, and then what follows is a label, which I've called email. What you call that, it's entirely up to you, as long as it does actually match the name of a receiver within the receiver section. What I've done is to call this email because it's for sending emails. We've then got a repeat interval, which is to decide how long do you wait once you've actually successfully sent an alert before sending the next one. In other words, maybe somebody actually was sent an alert, but maybe they were too busy, they were away from their phone, away from the computer, whatever it is. Maybe they didn't get that alert, or maybe you want to leave them long enough time to actually deal with the actual alert before sending the next one as a reminder. Entirely up to you what you set this as. The recommendation is 3 hours upwards. The actual example they've got on the website is 4 hours, which to me seems reasonable, so that's why I'm going with 4 hours. We then got a group by entry, which I've got it set to alert name. Now, for me, the actual network setup I've got is pretty simple. So that's good enough for me to actually group alerts together and then send them off to an actual email system. But what I would suggest is checking out the documentation, because there's quite a few choices you've got in here that you can do to group your emails, in this case, together. And you can have multiple entries in here if you want to as well, which would make a lot more sense on a large network. But as I say, I'm just going to keep things simple and just go with the alert name. We've then got a receiver section, which is where you start to put all the actual details of the actual endpoint you're actually sending these alerts to. So for an email server here, what we've got is, well, we've got an IP address and a port number of the actual server we're sending to. We've got a from address, a to address. Now, if you're going to be sending it to a server and you need authentication, well, you'd have to put the authentication details in here as well. I'm actually using an internal SMTP gateway called Mirrorless. And the way I've got that set up at the moment is it doesn't require authentication, and I need to get around to actually putting a certificate on there. Once I do, all the actual servers that actually support it, they'll actually need an actual root certificate to be able to actually trust that actual server certificate. And I don't want to complicate this video too much. I want to try to keep things as simple as possible. So for that reason, I've got TLS disabled. So require underscore TLS has been set to false. Now, if you're not familiar with Mirrorless, it's actually a pretty useful system, I must admit, because it's an easy way to set up your own internal SMTP gateway. The actual to address in this case is actually set to slack@mirrorless.xyz. And what that means actually is, even though I'm going to be sending an alert, it's ultimately going to get turned into an actual Slack message. Now, Prometheus here, or rather Alertmanager I should say, does actually support Slack, but I want to keep things as simple as possible. So the idea is all of my devices should be able to support emails, in which case I can just configure them all to send emails to this Mirrorless server. And then if I change my mind somewhere down the line, and maybe I want to use Telegram instead of Slack, all I've got to do is make a change to the actual Mirrorless configuration. I don't have to go around all the other servers. But what you use here is entirely up to you. In any case, now that I've got that configured, I'm going to save that. And then what I need to do is to actually start this up. So because I'm using Docker Compose, we'll do Docker Compose up and then -D to do this in the background. Should go quick because it's already been downloaded, the image that is. So what I can now check is just the status, just to make sure there's no errors. So the top entry that I've got is the actual Alertmanager that we've just spun up. It's not reporting that it's been restarted at all, so it's just staying up, in which case we should be good to go. Now, Prometheus and Alertmanager are separate entities. So what I now need to do is to actually update the configuration of Prometheus to tell it about Alertmanager. But while I'm there, I'm also going to tell it about a rules file. And the reason being is that when it comes to actually setting up alerts within Prometheus, they're stored within a separate configuration file. So for me, I need to edit the main configuration file for Prometheus, and that's called prometheus.yml, and it's in a folder called Prometheus. And then what I want to do is to copy and paste in the details for this. So what I've got defined now within the global section is an evaluation interval. Now, this is actually set to 15 seconds by default. So technically I don't really need to put that there if I'm not going to change it, but I like to have that there as a marker. Just on the off chance, maybe I might change my mind and maybe I want to set this to a higher value or a lower value, depending on how things go. But what I then need is a rule_files section, and there we actually tell it about the actual configuration files for our actual rules. So I've got this one called rules.yml. And then I've got a new alerting section which points it to Alertmanager. So in this case, all of these containers are running on the same computer, but because they're actually separate containers, I'm having to use the actual real IP address of the actual computer and pointing it to port 9093, which is what Alertmanager is listening on. So now that I put those details in, I'm going to save that configuration file, and that updates that part of Prometheus. Now, as I mentioned previously, when it comes to setting up alerts for Prometheus, you're going to be storing these in a separate file, a rule file. I've defined that within the actual Prometheus configuration. So what I need to do now is to actually create that file. So I called it rules.yml. So I'm going to create a file, rules.yml. I'm putting it in the same Prometheus folder where the main config file is. And then within here, I'm going to set up an actual rule to check if an instance goes down. So we've got a group section defined, and then what you've got is name, which then set to alert_rules. Now, you can actually have more than just alert rules. You can have recording rules, for example, but this is a way in which you actually group your actual rules together. So we have to call this alert_rules if we're going to be defining alerting rules. And then we have a rules section defined. And then underneath there is where you start to create all of your actual alerts that you want to monitor, instances, services, and so on. Now, in this case, I'm creating one. I'm going to call it instance down because that's what I want to check. If an instance goes down, I want an alert. We then define the actual expression for this alert. Now, this is just a basic example. An instance can be up with a value of 1, meaning it's actually up, or it can have a value of 0, meaning it's down. So that's a relatively simple expression to actually test against for checking if a server's gone down, for example. We've then got a for setting, which is basically how long does this actual instance or this expression of 0 have to stay like that before we actually trigger an alert. And in this case, we're going to wait 5 minutes. So once an instance goes down, or at least it's actually monitors going down, we're going to wait 5 minutes essentially before we trigger an actual alert and send it over to Alertmanager. Then we have our labels, and we've got a severity here set to critical. You can have different actual values for this, entirely up to you what you want to classify that as. In my case, if a server goes down, well, to me, it's going to be classed as critical. And then within this annotations section, you start putting your details about the actual alert. So you can have words and you can have variables and so on that you put in here. But what I've got here is for the actual summary that you get, you'll get instance and then the actual label for that instance. It's going to vary depending on what the actual instance is, but essentially it's going to tell us that something has gone down. And then within the actual description, it gives us a bit more information in terms of the actual job, because we're running multiple jobs. I mean, I've got a black box exporter, for example, I've got a node exporter, and I'm going to have a lot of different types of jobs running in Prometheus, each of which could tell me potentially something is down. So I want a bit more details as to, well, who's telling me about this actual instance going down. And then I'm just also saying that it's been down for more than 5 minutes, for instance. So I'm going to save that configuration there. And that gives us our first alerting rule. Now, although we've actually created a rules file for Prometheus and we've told Prometheus about it, the problem is we're dealing with containers here, in which case I actually now need to tell the container about this configuration file. So because I'm using Docker Compose, I need to edit the Docker Compose YML file. And then I need to go down to my actual Prometheus container, and I'm going to map that rules file across so that the actual container knows about it. Now, just need to make sure the spacing's correct. So that's the actual file that it's expecting, /etc/prometheus/rules.yml. But I'm basically redirecting it over to this rules.yml file that I created within the Prometheus folder of the computer itself. So I'm going to save that. Now, although I've got a means to actually restart Prometheus on the fly, the thing is, this is a change to the actual container itself. In which case, to actually update this, I need to stop that container. Then once that's actually done, I need to spin it back up again. And I'm just going to double check to make sure there's no problems. So Prometheus was the last one to get started back up again. It's not complaining of any restart, so that's a good sign. I mean, obviously if there are any problems, you can actually check the log files. But it looks like we're now up and running. Now I've deliberately set things up and waited long enough to actually trigger some alerts so that we can test things out. And although we're actually creating rules within a config file, you can actually check the state of alerts within the GUI here. So if you connect into Prometheus through your web browser, if you then click on alerts, it actually tells you about any alerts that are active in this case. So I've got instance down and then 2 active. So if I expand that out, I mean, instance down is actually referring to the actual alert that we created. And it gives us more details here about that actual alert. But then lower down, we've got details about the actual devices that are actually triggering these alerts. So we get some useful information. I mean, we've got details about the alert name, what the instance is, in this case it's IP address, the job that it applies to, the severity, which in this case is critical because that's what we set it to there. The state in this case is firing because we've actually exceeded the 5-minute wait period. And then active since tells you basically when the actual alert was triggered, but bear in mind this is UTC time, so it's running behind for me by about an hour here in the UK. But essentially it's telling me that there are actually 2 devices that have triggered an alert. The only thing is you've got to be careful with expressions because you can't just blindly create these alerting rules and assume they're going to work. Because in the case of this up equals 01, for example, if I go to status and then to targets, what I've got is a black box exporter, and it's reporting both devices, an Apache 1 server and Apache 2 server here as being up. It's saying my node exporter is up, Prometheus is up, Proxmox, I've got a PDE exporter monitoring 3 Proxmox servers. Well, 1's up, 2's down, so essentially that's what those alerts are for. These are being picked up as being down. And then I've got speed test exporter, which it's finally got around to doing, so that's in a state of up as well. But what I'll point out is that actually only Apache 1 is up, Apache 2 is actually down. So when it comes to this black box exporter, you're not really getting the full picture here. By the looks of it, the state seems to be applying more to the actual state of the actual endpoint, the exporter itself, rather than the actual device that we're monitoring. This is all set up to actually monitor TLS certificates on servers. So in this particular case, it's not that big of a concern, but it's something I need to bear in mind. I can't rely on this up expression to get the actual true state of the actual end devices themselves. So do bear that in mind, but at least as you can see here, this is an easy way to actually check if alerts are being triggered and what is actually the reason behind it. Well, ultimately what we want to receive is an actual alert, and as you can see, I've got one here on Slack. Key thing to point out is there's only one message. There are 2 servers down, but there's only one message, and I really do like that. If I click on show more, you can see I've got 2 alerts, and then it's telling me this is alert 1 essentially, and that's alert 2. So we've got 2 different servers based on the IP addresses being different. In a real network, and especially if it's much bigger, it would be a lot better if these were fully qualified domain names, but it really boils down to how you've actually configured Prometheus to do that. In the lab, IP addresses aren't that big of a deal, I must admit. But the key thing is, it's grouped them together because we actually asked it to do that. It's grouped them based on the actual alert name. And both of these alerts all fall under that same alert rule, although granted we only actually have one alert at this stage anyway. But another key thing I like about this is, aside from the fact I've got one message covering both servers, is the fact that it's now automated basically. I don't have to touch Prometheus or Alertmanager to deal with this. I just have to go and fix the problems on these 2 servers. And then that's it, the alerts will disappear. If on the other hand I don't do anything, then in about 4 hours time, I'll get another alert to tell me, well, information about whatever actual servers are still down. So I do like that compared to other systems where you've actually got to acknowledge alerts and deal with the actual alerts. This is all fully automated. And then all I've got to then do really is, once this is all resolved, is to delete the actual messages. You'd have to do that with any other system anyway. So yeah, I think this is a much easier way, I'm finding at least, of actually dealing with alerts on them systems. So it's not too bad to set up. I mean, we've got to set up the alert manager, and then we've got to do some tweaks with Prometheus itself. But once it's all up and running, you can get simple alerts like this. Now you might be wondering, where on earth did I get this expression from, and how do you actually create your own expressions to create other types of alerts? Well, it usually begins here on the actual home page of Prometheus, because it's all about the actual metrics that are being gathered, having a look and see what the results are, and then setting up conditions to trigger your actual rules. Now, first time you connect to Prometheus, this is what you get. If you're on another page, what you can do is click on the Prometheus name or actual icon. The result is the same, you get this page here. And then here what you can do in this expression field is to actually start just typing away for the actual metrics. So in that example of an alert I provided, we used up. And it doesn't just start filtering out based on the first character. It literally gives you the results where up, in this case, is present in anything in the actual name of a metric. So it's a good way to actually just filter things out if you're not quite sure what you're looking for. It's a good way to filter things out, so it's very, very useful. Now, if all you do is just hit return or click on the execute button, what it's going to do is it's actually going to come back with the actual instances in this case related to where up has some sort of value based on whatever actual exporter you're using. And then it gives you those results over in the right-hand page, right-hand column here. And then what you can do is use those values essentially to work out your actual alerts. So in our case, we want to know if something's down. Well, in my case, everything is up. Everything has a value of 1. If it goes down, it would have a value of 0. So that's why the expression would be up equals 0. So if I just hit return, I don't get anything back. And if I said anything that's up, then I get all of these ones back. So it's quite a useful way to actually search for and test out your actual expressions. But there's also the actual metrics explorer here. If you click on that, you can literally just work your way through all of the actual known metrics, or again, you can filter them out. Now, when you're just getting started, or if you're looking for some sort of idea, you've got a rough idea of what it is you're looking for and how you think it might be done. But what I would suggest is going to this page here. This is actually, as it says, awesome Prometheus alerts. There's some really good examples here. So we've got a big long laundry list related to the actual topic here of what the actual alert's about. But if you actually select one of these, like host and hardware, for example, you then get a lot, and I mean a lot, of examples of alerts that you can actually put in. It's the entire alert itself. It's not just the expression you're getting here. You're getting the entire alert and all the sort of ways in which they've set this up, and then you can customize these to your own liking, basically. So it's extremely useful. So as I say, I mean, this is definitely a place I would suggest checking out. Now, if a computer runs out of disk space, chances are it'll stop working. And although Prometheus does have a pretty sophisticated algorithm that can actually warn you in advance and tell you how long you've actually got before you're going to run out of disk space, I do prefer to actually go by a rule of thumb of about 80%. And what I'm looking for is an alert when you've actually exceeded about 80% of capacity. The reason being is, well, I want plenty of time to actually prepare to either bring up disk space or to actually replace the drive. But also because once you get beyond that 80%, what you tend to find is, like any other resource, things slow down. So it's going to take longer to write to disk and longer to read from disk. So what we can actually do to build an expression is start looking at the metrics. So if I use this one here for Linux computers, it's coming back and actually telling me the amount of storage that's available. Then if I use this metric here, what this one actually does is come back and tell you about the capacity. Now, what we're really only interested in is this one here, where the mount point is /. So what we can do is combine those two metrics together and filter it out. And it's actually coming back and essentially telling me roughly what sort of amount of capacity we've got left. But it's best if I turn that into a percentage so it's a bit easier to read. So I'm getting told that we've got about 84% of the disk space left here. And what I can do is make things a bit simpler even still by rounding this down by using that round function there. So it's coming back and saying we've got about 84.31%. So we've still got plenty of capacity left on this particular file storage here, but this is how I would go about building expressions, for example, and testing things out to see what I'm looking for. So when it comes to the actual alert itself, what that means is we can now actually set up an alert to actually warn us. So if I go and edit my rules file, then when I need to create a new rule, this is an alerting rule. So for me, they all go under this name here of alert rules and under the rules section. So I'm going to copy and paste in a new rule. So I'm just calling this host out of disk space. There's the expression that we had, except this time I've got less than 20%. In other words, I'm asking for a warning when we've got less than 20% capacity left. In other words, we've gone beyond 80% of capacity. It's not critical as such. There should be enough time, so I'm setting the severity here to warning. And then we've got a summary followed by a description. Now, one thing I'll say is that what I've found out is it makes absolutely no difference what order I put these in. To me, it makes sense to have a summary first, then a description afterwards, but Prometheus doesn't seem to care. What I'll do is I'll just save this. We'll restart, or rather I'll reload the config for Prometheus on the fly because I've got the ability to do that. Otherwise I would have to restart the container. If we go back to Prometheus, if we go to alerts and just refresh that, I've now got two alerts here. Neither of them are going to fire off, but you notice the description here is at the top, then the summary comes below. So even though I've got the summary first, then the description, we've here got the description and then the summary. So that's what the alert's actually going to end up looking like for me, essentially. It does contain quite a bit of useful information in it anyway. I mean, that value, incidentally, is this here. That's what that variable represents. So if you want to start tweaking the output, essentially here, for your value that you've got, that's where you start applying the functions usually up here, rather than within the actual annotation portion of it. Do your changes here to kind of make things easier and cleaner to understand, and then it just gets dumped out as a value here. But that for me is a pretty easy enough way to actually get an alert for when a computer's about to run out of disk space. 80%, as I say, is about that borderline case. Once you get above there, things slow down, but maybe you can start to free up disk space, as I said, by deleting things before you actually have to resort to upgrade things. And at about 80%, you should have enough time, I would imagine, to actually order replacement parts or do a plan to do a complete upgrade if necessary. So relatively easy to do once you understand how these metrics can be put together to create these sort of expressions. So that's why being able to carry out expression tests within here is extremely useful. Now, if you're manually managing TLS certificates on servers, you'll want an alert before a certificate expires. And what we can do with the expression builder is to actually test things out here. So I'm using the black box exporter to actually monitor certificates. So what I can do is take that metric of when the actual certificate expires and subtract the actual time at this very moment in time to compare the two. Hit return, it comes back with a value which at the moment really doesn't make much sense. It would look a lot easier if this was saying how many days it was left, but we can actually tweak things in the actual alert itself. So if we go to the terminal and edit the config for the rules file, and then I'll go right to the end and I'll create a new alert. So there's the same expression that we had before, but because we want an alert, we need some sort of condition. So what I've got here is basically to say, is the result of that less than 7 days? That's what we're multiplying 86,400 by 7 for. If you want more days or less days than that, just change the 7 here. But again, we're waiting for a certain period of time. We want to make sure that this is actually valid. For severity, I'm only using warning because it's not really critical, not yet. Nothing's actually broken yet. And then because of what I've experienced before, where it doesn't really make any difference whether you have the summary or the description defined first, Prometheus just decides for itself. In this particular alert, all I'm going to do is just have a description. But one thing to point out is that I'm actually piping out the value that we've got here to this humanized duration function, just to make it easier to understand. So what I'm going to do is save the file. Then I'm going to get Prometheus to update its configuration on the fly. Now that is going to take a while before Prometheus actually notices anything, because there's plenty of time still left before this certificate actually expires. It's not going to notice. But I've been tweaking around and playing around with the actual expiry limits here. So this is what the actual alert ends up looking like, for example. So in that case, what I did is I actually set this up so that it would actually pick up certificates that expired in less than 360 days, just so I can show you an example of the output. And that's the type of alert that you get. So rather than that big number, you can see we're getting it's going to expire in 330 days, 17 hours, 0 minutes and 45 seconds. I mean, it's a bit too much information, but it's still easier to understand. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourself that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.